Great, Angela. Thanks, and thank you to everybody for joining this morning. Um, we're going to be discussing some of the basic considerations for de-identification this morning. And I imagine that this is information that will be new to some of you and relatively basic for others. But my hope is that it helps people and agencies that are new to this to get started with approaching these topics, and that for those of you with more experience, it's an opportunity to refresh the basics and really think about why you do what you do and make improvements as necessary. We're going to start off by talking about some of the reasons why you may be interested in de-identifying data in the first place. We're going to talk about de-identification as a risk exercise, talk about some things you may want to consider when you're starting to develop standards or when you're approaching new de-identification issues, go into some slightly more advanced considerations, and then wrap it up by talking about specific considerations for aggregate reporting. So before we even get into why would you de-identify, I think we need to start out with a common understanding of what we're talking about with de-identification. And what I mean when I say de-identification is the process to reduce the likelihood of a person's identity being revealed by removing or hiding identifiable information. And we'll continue to fine-tune this throughout the presentation. There's certainly room for nuance, but this is the basic idea. And an important thing to note is that when we're talking about the verb de-identification, when we're talking about that process, it doesn't necessarily mean that the only outcome is the end product of like the noun de-identified data, that there is a whole spectrum in the middle there. It's possible and sometimes helpful to remove some information without making data fully de-identified, as we'll talk about. So one of the main reasons, probably the main reason why you may want to de-identify is to reduce the legal requirements on the data. And that is because privacy laws generally only apply to identifiable information. So we know that there is a huge range of protections that apply to confidential information under different laws, different regimes, certainly different here than it is in the EU. But this idea is common to all of those laws. In the EU, you have the GDPR as a comprehensive law that specifically talks about the fact that it applies to any information concerning an identified or identifiable natural person. And in the US, where we have a sectoral approach where it has to be information linked to something like health or financial or educational information, there still is that prerequisite that it be identifiable information. And just to make sure I'm really drilling this home and at risk of overdoing it, if only identifiable information is protected, then that means that de-identified information is not. You don't have to take my word for this because many privacy laws explicitly contemplate this concept and explicitly state this. So in the GDPR, you have the statement that the principles of data protection do not apply to information that doesn't relate to an identified or identifiable natural person. In HIPAA, you have this explicit statement that health information that doesn't reveal the identity of an individual and with respect to which there is no reasonable basis to believe that the information could be used to identify an individual is not individually identifiable health information at all. And then in Graham-Leach-Bliley, we have this statement that personally identifiable information does not include information that does not identify a consumer, such as aggregate information or blind data that doesn't contain identifiers. You may also be interested in de-identification for purposes of public disclosure, and I mean public disclosure in two different ways. The first is in the context of the Public Records Act and responding to records requests, and you may need to remove personal information when responding to public records requests when the requester is not authorized to view the personal information. And the second is that you can proactively release de-identified information to improve transparency. And so in our role as public agencies, we should be viewing de-identified data as a possible public good that should be published. The next reason you might de-identify is to reduce security requirements. And this is similar to the idea of reducing legal requirements, but I've included it here as a separate reason because it has a very specific interaction with security requirements for state agencies. OCIO policies require agencies to categorize data from 1 to 4. So in category 1, we're talking about public information, which is basically information that already is or could be released to the public freely. Category 2 information is more sensitive information that you wouldn't release unless specifically asked for it, but it isn't specifically protected and you couldn't withhold it from a public records request. Then once you get to category 3 and 4 data, we're talking about information that's not subject to public disclosure. Category 3 is confidential information that's protected from release, and category 4 is confidential information that has more specific handling requirements and where there could be more significant consequences from it being inadvertently released. So because of the fact that categories 3 and 4 are more sensitive and are not subject to public disclosure, they're subject to much more stringent security requirements. Through the process of de-identification, you can effectively turn category 3 or 4 data into category 1 or 2 data, which could have a big operational impact. So if you imagine you're standing up a new system that's going to handle personal information, if you determine you can meet your needs using only de-identified data, then it's likely you'll have an easier time negotiating with vendors, meeting security requirements, and ultimately you're going to be able to get that new system up and running much easier. The last two things I included here are really just more general principles. So the first one is data minimization. So you may want to de-identify just for the purpose of meeting the data minimization principle. Even if your agency has a completely valid need to collect detailed data, that doesn't mean that every person with access needs to view all the data. So you may want to de-identify it for certain internal audiences. And in a similar way, even if you are sharing with a third party who has a completely valid reason to receive the information, you should always be considering how you can remove as much information as possible before sharing the information while still letting the third party perform whatever function it may be that they're performing. And then the last one here is purpose limitation. And purpose limitation is essentially a principle that you should specify the things you'll do with personal information before you collect it. And the reason that I included this one here is because de-identification may allow information to be used for purposes that otherwise would have been incompatible with the original reason you collected the information. So, whoops. The really obvious example here is that your agency may collect data to perform a specific function, but they want to use the data for unrelated or loosely related research purposes like that, or loosely related research purposes, and de-identifying could allow those other purposes. These reasons are definitely not exhaustive. I'm sure there are many, many other reasons why you may want to go through a de-identification exercise. But the idea is just whenever you are considering these issues, you want to consider why you're doing it in the first place, because that's going to help guide decisions and standards later on. So in this next section, we're going to talk about why you should be treating de-identification as a risk exercise. Whether information is appropriately de-identified can have significant consequences. We already talked about the fact that it can make a difference in whether you're subject to certain laws, whether you need specific security requirements, whether you're appropriately responding to public records requests. And because of that, it's very tempting and very human to think of it as a binary thing where information is either identified or it's not. And that would be very convenient. It's easy to teach people. It's easy to have consistency. But unfortunately, that's wrong. There are a lot of studies out there that you may have seen that show people can often be identified even when there's limited information available, like zip and age and gender. And there's some debate about whether those studies are exaggerated, but it is not at all debated that it's almost impossible to completely de-identify data to the point that it's fully anonymous while retaining any usefulness for the information. So with that being the case, whether information is identifiable is better thought of as a spectrum rather than as a binary question. And the spectrum goes from identifiable information on one end all the way to truly anonymous information on the other end. Another way you could think about this is thinking about the effort needed to link information to a specific person, which ranges from identifiable on the left side here with something like their name right in the record, to completely anonymous on the other end. And that would be something that's completely impossible to link to a specific person, no matter how much effort you put into it. Before we go any further, we're going to take a quick glossary break to talk about what some of these terms mean and where there's some room for debate and different uses out there. Starting with identifiable. So there are lots of different terms used in different laws to talk about what is protected. You may hear the phrases personal information, personally identifiable information, individually identifiable information, and then some laws, especially when we're talking about our own public records exemptions, tend to use phrases like information that can be readily associated with an individual instead of actually using a defined term. So there can be variations in these, but for today, we're just going to assume that identifiable information is the broader term that can include all of those variations. The next category here that you see occupies two boxes is pseudonymous data. So this is data that's not quite fully identifiable, but it's also not de-identified yet. So it's information that allows re-identification when combined with other information. So this could be something that has some indirect identifiers, which we'll talk about later, that allow re-identification. Or it could be something that has like a unique system or research ID assigned to individuals. And in that sense, it's very similar to like a writer who is publishing books under a pseudonym, under a pen name. To the public, it looks anonymous, but to the publisher who put those books out, they could very easily link it back to the actual writer. And then on the right side here, we have de-identified and anonymous. So I put anonymous all the way out to the right because theoretically, truly anonymous data is out there on the end of the spectrum. But in practice, most people more or less treat them as being the same. I'm not going to say that's always true. But for today, let's just assume that de-identified and anonymous mean the same thing. And another phrase that you may hear people talk about is non-personal. And we're just going to assume also that that is the same as de-identified or anonymous. So going back to the spectrum, we know in reality that it's nearly impossible to make data truly anonymous. So for all intents and purposes, the far right end of the spectrum isn't actually reachable. So what we have to do is figure out when are we far enough over to the right to consider the information to be de-identified. And what we're doing when we do that is we're making this somewhat imaginary distinction between pseudonymous data and de-identified data. And this is, or the fact is that there's no magic point where the information becomes de-identified. This is really just a risk decision of when you're satisfied that the risk of re-identifying a specific person is sufficiently low. And you're making that decision with the knowledge that the risk is never actually going to equal zero. So that means that there's no silver bullet for de-identification. And I think we all know that making risk determinations is hard and data is hard. So when you put those two things together, we have quite a challenging topic here. The appropriate standards are going to vary significantly depending on things like the applicable laws, the detail of the data, the context of a specific request or project. So in the next few slides, we're just going to talk through some of the really basic things to think about when you start making de-identification decisions. And really the most basic one is you need to identify the applicable laws because you have to understand where the protections from or for your information come from. Sometimes they may provide very little guidance, but even so, it's important to understand the exact language used in the context for those laws. And if you have information that doesn't have um, a lot of detail in the applicable laws, don't be afraid to look to other laws for guidance to see what other people are doing. Just don't rely on those other laws. So just to go through some examples of where there is guidance out there, in Graham-Leach-Bliley, you have this statement that says personally identifiable information does not include information that doesn't identify a consumer, such as aggregate information or blind data that does not contain personal identifiers, such as account numbers, names, or addresses. So that obviously doesn't get us all the way there, but it at least gets us to the point where we know account numbers, names, or addresses are not going to be allowed to stay in de-identified data, and then we still have to figure out what else needs to be removed. FERPA goes a little bit further. We have the name again, but you also have the name of their family. We have address again, and then we're talking about other personal identifiers and other indirect identifiers, such as date of birth or place of birth. But one of the interesting things about FERPA and something that you really need to look out for in any law that's protecting information is that it's not uncommon at all for these laws to have a ton of caveats that make it so you can't really rely on it, and it doesn't really help your risk decision that much. So here we have the statement that identifiable information includes, but is not limited to these things. And then it gets really rough when you get down to F and G. So in F, you have this statement that it includes other information alone or in combination that's linked or linkable to a specific student that would allow a reasonable person in the school community to identify a person. So here we're not even talking about a member of the public, but you have to specifically look at it through the lens of a person in that community who may have more information and may have a greater ability to re-identify a person. Um, Another example is our Washington State breach notification law, which is not a data protection law necessarily, or it's at least not a privacy law. And it also is not a de-identification standard, but this is just another place you can look to think about the types of things that may be considered protected information or identifiable information. And then the last thing, last specific law I wanted to show was HIPAA, which actually has a very specific and explicit standard for de-identification. And this is really one of the only laws, if not the only law, that has a true safe harbor, where if you do this, you get to call it good. So you don't have to make that risk determination as long as you can meet these standards. It requires you to remove 18 specific types of identifiers, which you can see here. It includes things like all geographic subdivisions smaller than a state, except the first 3 digits of a zip code. You have to remove all elements of dates except for the year. So it does require quite a bit of information removal. And then it's also coupled with the fact that you can't have actual knowledge that the information could be used to re-identify a person. So again, this is a much friendlier definition to someone who's trying to apply it than the FERPA standard, where you have to think about a reasonable person in the community. Once you know what laws apply to the information, you're going to want to make sure you understand the different types of identifiers and what you're looking for when you de-identify. So the commonly used terms out there are direct identifiers and indirect identifiers. You may also hear the phrase quasi-identifiers as another word for indirect. These are pretty imprecise terms actually that don't have universal definitions. They can change from law to law, or laws may kind of contemplate them but not define them. But in general, what we're talking about with the direct identifier is information uniquely associated with an individual. So something that has a one-to-one relationship with that person, like their name or their very specific address or social security number, something that's associated with only that person. And then with indirect identifiers, we're talking about things that aren't uniquely associated with that person, but that could be used in combination with other information to identify a person. So it's not a direct identifier, but it's something describing that person that could lead them to be identifiable. These are some examples of direct identifiers. Name, I think we already talked about, specific street address, telephone number, email, social security number. You also see other things that you may not immediately have thought of, like vehicle identifiers and IP addresses. We see photos and biometric identifiers as well. And this is not necessarily completely exhaustive list, but it's pretty comprehensive of what you're likely to see. And these are actually the direct identifiers that come from HIPAA. Um, and then indirect identifiers. So when we're talking about indirect identifiers, it could be something like demographic information. So someone's age or their birth date especially, but their gender, their race, ethnicity, what languages they speak. You could have geographic information, and here we're not talking about their specific address, which would be very identifiable, but maybe you just give their zip code or the town they live in, which could help identify them. You could have where they work or what their job is. You could have the time or date of a specific event, like when they were admitted to the hospital, or a specific diagnosis or procedure information. So all of these types of things could help re-identify a person, even if you don't know their name. Um, Whenever you're looking at different identifiers, you always need to be aware that there isn't a comprehensive list, and keep your eyes open for other unique information. So information that describes physically observable characteristics is always more likely to be identifiable. And then the other thing to look out here is to be wary of any free text in records or data. Like when you're talking about a voice recording, there could be anything in that. Or if you're looking at notes, there could be anything in that. So an example here is a therapist note that's completely redacted, but says patient was concerned about decreasing volume of gold coins in his money pool. And even though there's no identifiers in there, you probably have a pretty good idea that the therapist patient was Scrooge McDuck. The next thing to be aware of is what I've called here the problem of, or the concept of more data, more problems. So basically, the more variables or data points included, the higher the likelihood of re-identification is. And that's because you're painting a more and more complete picture of a person, even if none of the individual points are particularly sensitive or likely to identify the person. So location data is a good example of this. If you have one random data point from a person, it probably reveals nothing about them. But if you collect 20 data points a day, it could reveal their identity as well as where they live, where they work, where they shop, where their kids go to school, and that they're seeing a psychiatrist. So again, you just always need to be aware of compiling a significant amount of data. And then beyond the data itself, you always need to, or the data or information itself, you need to always be conscious of the context and the audience for the information. So these are just some of the questions you should be thinking about. So who will have access to the information and who is it being shared with? And will they sign an agreement that they will not attempt to re-identify people? So it's a very different analysis if you're releasing information to the public versus if you're sharing with a partner who is willing to sign a confidentiality agreement and say that they're not going to try to re-identify people. Then you also need to look at questions like, does this person or does the recipient have any other information that would allow them to identify people? Um, because information that is not at all identifiable to some people could be highly identifiable to others who have more information about the people involved. And then you also need to ask, what is the nature of the information and what are the potential consequences if a person is re-identified? So the basic concept here is just that there is sensitive information that deserves a higher level of scrutiny and may lead you to make different risk determinations. Um, if you are working with data about abortions, for example, or a public records request that involves a person in the address confidentiality program, those would be examples of where you want to carefully consider your risk and make sure you're fully de-identifying the information. Okay, so we're going to go through just a few more considerations here. And the first one is really basic, but I wanted to make sure we touched on redaction tools and cover the fact that de-identification is pointless if the appropriate information is removed using the wrong tools. So just to highlight some very common examples, and I want to say these are um, not just examples from Washington state agencies. These are common everywhere, but they are big mistakes. So placing a white box over the text in a Word document does not remove the content. Obviously, it's very easy for somebody to go ahead and just move that box and see what's underneath it. Sometimes people use Adobe and think that just because they put a box over it there, or because the Adobe software has the capability of making redactions, that they've done it appropriately, but you actually have to go through the process of finalizing the redactions and flattening the document to actually remove the content. Um, Hiding a tab in Excel doesn't remove the content. And then the last one here is just that even if a record itself is appropriately redacted and de-identified, you need to make sure that the metadata doesn't have anything that could reveal something about that person. So, I mean, in the worst case, it could have something like their name actually, but even if it has um, detailed date and time information as an example, sometimes that could be considered a quasi-identifier that makes it no longer de-identified. And whatever is appropriate for your agency and whatever the standards are that you decide on, you just need to make sure that the staff who release or publish data have access to the appropriate tools and that they know how to use them. Um, so far, we've pretty much contemplated just manual review of different data fields to determine which elements need to be removed. Um, but I wanted to at least briefly cover here the fact that it's also possible and sometimes preferable to use statistical analysis to determine the risk of re-identification. And this has some big advantages. The biggest one being that if you're making across the board determinations about what information to remove, you're probably going to be removing a lot more than you actually need to. And by using statistical analysis, you might be able to minimize the information loss, which makes the information more usable. So going back to HIPAA again, in HIPAA, you have this provision that specifically contemplates that a person with appropriate knowledge of statistical and scientific principles um, can determine that the risk is very small, that the information could be used alone or in combination with other reasonably available information by an anticipated recipient to identify an individual who is a subject of the information. Um, and I think that this description is interesting because it talks and incorporates some of the principles that we've already talked about. It says that the statistician just needs to find that the risk is very small. So here you have a federal regulator who is specifically acknowledging that the risk is never zero. And it also contemplates the idea of reviewing who the recipient is. So again, this is the regulator signaling that they know that context is an important piece of this. Other laws don't specifically contemplate the idea of statistical analysis, but I think it's pretty reasonable to assume that an expert could help determine whether there is a risk of re-identification, regardless of what laws apply to your information. Just like you can use statistics instead of a manual review to make de-identification decisions, also want to cover the fact that completely removing or redacting information is not the only method to de-identify. There are other things that result in less information loss that you can do. The first one here is data masking, which is actually a very broad term. And encompasses a lot of other different techniques. So I'm just going to cover a little bit of it here. But the general idea is that the original data is obscured to hide sensitive information. And this could be particularly useful for something like an internal use case where you're setting controls and setting role-based access for staff who have different needs to access different levels of information. And this is a different concept from encryption, although they're similar. And the main reason is that masking is intended to not be reversible. So the user shouldn't be able to retrieve the original data from the masked version that they see. And so one example of this would be just replacing the actual data with fake data to create test data. And the other probably very common one is that a social security number might be visible for some users, but for other users, it shows up as just a series of X's. The next technique here is perturbation, which is basically just adding random noise to original values. So this is where you have some statistical valid methodology of basically changing the values in your data so that it becomes not identifiable without actually making the information less useful. Data swapping is kind of a similar concept, except for instead of adding noise, you're actually exchanging values between different records. So a very basic example of that would be swapping the age between two records in a data file. So the average values and counts for the kind of the sample as a whole still remain the same, but any one particular record anymore doesn't actually relate to a specific person, and so it becomes less identifiable. Another concept here is generalization, and this is something that I think we do all the time without realizing that we're doing it. And this is just replacing precise values with more general values. So you're doing generalization when you replace ages with age bands, as an example. And then the last one is microaggregation, which I'm not going to speak in detail about, but it's a statistical method to report average values for groups of people with similar indirect identifiers. So instead of reporting individual values, you're grouping similar people together and reporting out on them.
So Matt, Greg Tudor had a question in chat about saying, could the reverse be true? Re-identify by statistical analysis of big data.
Yes, part of the of what that statistical analysis should be that the expert is doing is considering what other data is available out there to the recipients, and that's all something that should be going into that calculation of how high that risk of re-identification is. Greg, does that answer your question? Whenever you're making these kinds of decisions, you need to be really sure that you're not making them in a vacuum and that you're considering the business needs of how this information is actually going to be used. And that's because different methods of removing data are going to have very different impacts on the resulting product. So if you're completely removing all identifiers, that's great if all you're doing is trying to de-identify it to respond to a public records request and you're meeting your legal requirements. But if you really want someone to still be able to do some analysis on that, it's entirely possible that you're making it useless for the intended purpose. When you're talking about generalizing data, that helps you keep more of the information in, but it also makes it difficult to make inferences about small changes or make comparisons, and those could be comparisons either over time as things change over time or across different populations. And then with perturbation, you're maintaining statistical accuracy by adding noise, but transparency is reduced because you've basically introduced fictional data into your data set. So if your goal is transparency as a public agency, that's probably not a good method for the products that you put out there for public consumption. I think all of this is really complicated by the fact that we also have to deal with the Public Records Act. So in Washington, we have the Public Records Act that says that records maintained by agencies concerning government functions are public records subject to disclosure under Washington's Public Records Act unless a specific exemption applies. And then we also have this intent statement that it shall be liberally construed and its exemptions narrowly construed. And this can create issues when you're trying to establish best practices and make risk decisions, but then have this law that says the exemptions are narrowly construed. So one example of a potential problem would be you are creating data sets to release publicly, and you're following your de-identification best practices, which means you're removing not only your direct identifiers, but a lot of indirect identifiers. And you feel pretty good that you've protected Washington residents when you put that out. But what happens when somebody then makes a request for more details about the data and you have to make individual decisions about which indirect identifiers can or can't be added back into it when push comes to shove? And another example would be when there's data where there's no direct identifiers involved, but you think that the requester actually knows the identity of a person in responsive records. So an example here would be if you had a media request for some type of protected report, when the name of the person involved has actually already been published and is in the public domain. So their identity is out there, but the specific information is not. Or another example would be a request for inmate records that would mean very little to the general public, but are very likely to be identifiable to other inmates. And just to overgeneralize here a little bit, Washington courts haven't necessarily taken the same approach to potential identifiability that I think most privacy professionals would advocate for. So these are just unsettled things, but they're considerations that need to be considered on a case-by-case basis. And then once you've thought about all of these things and others, you really, really need to document your decisions. I think this is true for everything privacy related, but especially something as squishy as this. So once you made those decisions, document them and explain them. And the appropriate level of formality is going to vary. Putting it in rules would obviously have the most authority, and it has the benefit of having public comment, which puts some more weight behind it. If you have some type of internal formal policy, that can help demonstrate the position and give you something to show to external audiences, but also to help with your internal stakeholders and make sure that you have consistency. And then something less formal, like some type of informal standard, is the most flexible. And for agencies that have a lot of different types of information that have to be flexible, that may be the most appropriate. The standards don't need to be absolute, and they probably shouldn't because of all the things that need to be considered on a case-by-case basis, and because of the fact that context matters so much. And again, just to highlight that the types of things that documenting the standards can help with, it can help you ensure internal compliance and consistency. It can be really helpful to help explain decisions to external stakeholders, like constituents or legislators or other agency partners who may want to understand why you're withholding certain information. And then it can also help you defend your actions if you're challenged in court or if you have an inquiry from a regulator. It'd be very helpful to have something on paper that was created at the time you made the decision instead of kind of recreated once you were challenged. So I'm going to switch over here to really move away from de-identification in individual records and towards aggregate reporting. So aggregate reporting is releasing summaries or counts instead of individual level information. And if you're dealing with very sensitive information, aggregate reporting is almost always going to be preferable to individual record level reporting. The aggregate reporting can be static or dynamic. So when I'm saying static, I'm thinking of like a snapshot of a moment in time with predetermined data points. Like I hand you a piece of paper and say, here's the chart. And with dynamic, we're talking about something that's updated over time, is closer to real time, and enables the user to interact with the data. And aggregate reporting is, it can be kind of confusing because there's another similar term out there called data aggregation. And that is a separate thing that's used to describe when somebody is gathering or aggregating data about a specific person to create a profile of the person. So think like Google or Amazon. And that's a very different type of aggregation. Aggregate reporting doesn't completely remove the risks. And here are just some of the risks and some of the principles to keep in mind when you're doing this reporting. And even though we're talking about aggregate reporting, these are really things that you could think about for individual level records too. So the first one here is just that you should be thinking about re-identification as one factor whenever you're deciding how you're going to report out to the public. So be thinking about date ranges and age ranges and geographic areas and what the impact of that is going to be on privacy. Another principle here is that the risk of re-identification rises when the number of people in an overall population gets smaller, or when the number of people with a specific characteristic gets smaller. And sort of a sub-issue of that is that the more variables you have, or the more cross-tabulations you allow, then the higher risk of re-identification there's going to be, because it's going to be easier to get to those smaller numbers. The next one here is that the risk of re-identification is going to rise if the identity of the people in the population is known, or the identity of respondents to a survey are known. So we're going to walk through a couple of examples in a school setting. And to highlight this, you can imagine that if you had reports from a random class that could be anywhere in Washington, it would not be very identifiable, but it could be very identifiable if you knew that it was from a specific class in your community. And then the last one here is just that the practical risk of re-identification rises with dynamic reporting. And I say practical because in theory, it shouldn't have a higher risk, but in practical terms, when you are giving the user control to manipulate data, it's more likely you're going to have some type of human error or something is going to be missed that allows a user to identify specific people. So one example that we're going to go through here is using an example of students who have taken a test in a class and the number of them that passed. And I should pause to say these are definitely, should be obvious, but not real examples. Our agencies that handle educational data do a really good job with this, and I'm confident they would not make these mistakes. So in this one, what should jump out to you is the number of males who took the test. That we had 15 who took the test and 1 passed the test. So if you are the person who passed the test, you now have knowledge that the other 14 boys in the class did not pass, which means that something has been revealed about those other 14 people. Suppressing small numbers can help reduce this risk. It's commonly just called small suppression or small number suppression. We have several agencies in Washington that have standards for this. As an example, the Department of Health has a standard that they typically suppress any cells with counts from 1 through 9. And the Healthcare Authority has a standard that they typically suppress cells with counts from 1 through 10. So when you actually do this, what you quickly realize is that suppressing the small number alone is not enough. If you just got rid of the 1, you could quickly go over and see that you have this percentage of 6.7%, which would allow you to quickly get back to the number 1, which is that small number we were trying to get rid of. So you have to suppress the percentage too. And as an aside, you should always round percentages anyways, unless there's a compelling reason to include it. And then in addition to that percent, you have to then also redact or suppress the 11, because otherwise, you know, there were 10 females who passed, 11 total, and so there must have only been 1 male who passed. And then for the same reason, you also have to suppress the percentage, the overall percentage. And obviously, this can lead to a lot of information loss, and it's why it's often very difficult to do any type of reporting, including aggregate reporting on small populations. So this is a different example where it may at first look like it would be fine to publish because most suppression standards allow a count of 0 to be published. So here you had 15 people take the test and none of them passed. But on a case-by-case basis, very large numbers like 0 or all may not be appropriate. And so in this case, by saying 0, even though that's generally allowed, what you've actually done is revealed that nobody passed, or in other words, you published a piece of personal information about each individual student. This is just another slight variation on that, where we're going to assume that the publisher took steps, they recognize this problem, and they decide they're going to suppress 0. And then they also implemented top and bottom coding on the percentage, which basically means you're establishing an upper and lower boundary for published values. So in this case, let's assume that they decided they'd set a rule that any percentage greater than 95% is published as greater than 95%, and any percentage lower than 5% is published as less than 5%. That may normally be a good practice, but in this case, because we had a small sample size to begin with, publishing less than 5% actually reveals that the true count is 0, and you have, again, revealed something about everybody who took the test. So top and bottom coding is a good idea, but this is just an example of why you need different boundaries for different population sizes. Just to quickly wrap this up, aggregate reporting is an effective way to provide information, and you can do things like apply suppression that reduces the risk, but it does have drawbacks. It's difficult to report on small population sizes. And one thing we didn't talk about is that it's susceptible to being undone using other available data. So if you're publishing other data sets, it may allow people to cross-reference it and identify people. And another thing that you want to be really careful about is if data is being reported out at different levels. So keeping with the school theme, if you have the same data being published at the state level, the district level, and the school level, you need to know and understand what's going out there at each level, because that's going to impact the likelihood of re-identification. You can combat that by trying to increase the sample size. So trying to report out by county instead of city, or school instead of class. You can try to blur the data to prevent small numbers. So we talked about with individual records, you can use an age range instead of a specific age, or you could roll up into categories like people who had heart surgery instead of listing each individual type of heart surgery. And each of these methods have different trade-offs. So you're going to, again, need to determine how the information will be used before developing your reporting standards. And then finally, you really want to make sure you have some type of review of these products and really try to break it. Whatever the protections are that you put on it, make sure you have someone who understands it looking at it to see if things have been applied correctly and if there are any unexpected results. Okay, so we're getting up against the end of our time here. So I just want to really quickly go through that. Whenever you're approaching these topics, make sure you understand what you're trying to accomplish by de-identifying and how the decisions you make are going to impact business needs to make sure you're making decisions that meet both your legal and kind of program needs. You want to make sure you identify and evaluate your applicable laws. And look at other laws that don't apply that could help you make decisions. I really encourage you to accept and come to grips with the fact that de-identification is a risk exercise. That's going to help you make smart decisions and explain what you're doing to other people in the agency who may want things to be binary. Should be creative and look at different options when you're creating your standards, and you should document those standards once you have them. And then finally, continually review both the standards and your individual products. Consider the context of requests and adjust as necessary. And with that, I will open it up to any questions.